By now, you've probably heard that Emilie is going to shake things up by finally making burning reaction relevant. Well, the reality is, nothing has changed about burning. It's still a pretty mediocre reaction in terms of how much damage it can deal. And instead, Emilie's overall potential absolutely depends on burning enemies. If the enemy is not burning, her damage can be as low as minus 400% or basically 4 times worse. So, in this video, I'm gonna show you everything you need to know about Emilie, what kind of damage potential she can actually achieve, how to build her, and which teams can utilize her. Okay, first things first, I'll be using this Emilie build to showcase the damage and explain her skills. So, she's gonna be equipped with a Favonius Lance and the Unfinished Reverie Artifacts set. On top of that, her talents are at levels 1, 9, and 9 respectively, and of course, she is Constellation 0. Now, starting off with her skill, she will create this object called Lumidu's Case, which will deal small amount of initial plus pneuma damage, and then it will attack a single enemy every 1.5 seconds, generate a particle every 2.5 seconds, and apply Dendro at most every 2 seconds roughly. And when it comes to range and AoE, the range is fine, but the AoE is almost non-existent. The enemies need to be within the kissing range of each other in order to get struck by the same attack. Finally, if you just leave the skill on the field, it will attack for a total of 14 times over its 22 seconds duration. But, as you can see, the damage is absolutely pitiful, barely scoring 2000 damage per hit, and that's because, as I said at the beginning of the video, Emilie heavily depends on burning targets, and it mainly has to do with 3 major abilities she capitalizes on. Okay, so first of all, this was a level 1 Lumidu's Case damage. It's got a really crappy multiplier, and in order to reach level 2, while the skill is deployed, nearby burning enemies will give off a scent every 2 seconds for the skill, and after 2 scent attacks are collected, the Lumidu's will reach level 2, and from then on, every single attack it makes will now have 2 shots with higher multipliers. Now, I don't know what kind of a freaky hobby Emilie has, you know, cause she's collecting scent of burning flesh from enemies, but you do you, Emilie. Still, we can already see the damage improving by a lot, going from roughly 3000 to almost 14,000 damage from every attack. However, this damage is already being boosted secretly by the second passive talent, which states that whenever Emilie deals damage to enemies, if they are burning, she gains a damage bonus based on her attack, capping out at maximum 36%, or if she has 2400 attack. But you can expect about at least 25% of this damage bonus to be active at all times, even when she's not utilizing any attack buffs. And then finally, her other passive talent says that when the level 2 Lumidu's Case collects 2 cents from burning enemies, it will release a chunky 600% attack multiplier onto an enemy, which has a pretty good AoE and really nice damage. In fact, this passive will make up roughly 1/3 of Emilie's overall damage output. And for my own testing, usually if you deploy the skill and the enemy remains burning throughout the whole duration, you can expect this passive to trigger up to 4 times total. So, as you can see, it is very important to have the enemy burning, since this means her skill can level up, she gains big damage bonus from her passive, and the other passive will also deliver additional attacks that produce significant numbers. And let's not forget, if she's using the Unfinished Reverie Artifacts set, it also provides best boosting when the enemy is burning. So all of this combined, without burning enemies, she is missing out on more than 400% additional damage. Okay, so that's her skill in a nutshell. What about her burst? Well, it only costs 50 energy, and when you activate it, she will summon a level 3 Lumidu's Case, which will constantly deliver pretty wide AoE damage for 2.8 seconds. Although, if it's just a single target, it will be attacked for a total of 6 times, and with this current build, they receive roughly 18,000 damage from each hit. However, the biggest selling point of this burst is that it stashes away the deployed skill during its short duration, and after the burst is over, the Lumidu's Case from the skill is redeployed, its duration is refreshed, and the previous level it had is maintained. So in other words, if you had a level 2 Lumidu's Case, which is dealing great damage, you then cast the burst, and once it's over, the level 2 Lumidu's Case appears again with refreshed duration in a new location. And because the burst has a short 13.5 seconds cooldown, while the duration of the skill is 22 seconds, well, I'm sure you understand by now, you can just maintain the level 2 Lumidu's forever, as long as you can cast the burst in time to reset its duration. Still, keep in mind there is one nasty drawback with Emilie. If there are no nearby burning targets for 8 seconds when her skill is summoned and the Lumidu's case is at level 2, it will revert back to level 1, unfortunately. So to put it simply, enemies need to keep burning in order for Emilie to excel. Oh, and by the way, don't cast her skill when the case is at level 2, because then it will be immediately reset back to level 1. The only way to maintain the level 2 case is by casting her burst. Now, if we take a look at her overall damage performance, assuming everything goes by perfectly and the enemy is constantly burning, she will then unleash roughly 403,000 damage in about 22 seconds, which is quite good for an off-field damage dealer. We can also see that the skill makes up about 44% of her total damage, while the burst and the passive are responsible for roughly 27 and 29% of her total damage. And let's not forget that you can build some comps where another teammate could be using Deepwood to boost her damage. So in that case, Emilie's damage will improve by about 22% with this build that I'm using, but it can be even better if she has a signature weapon, although that's a sad topic we're gonna get into in a moment. Also, one important thing to note is that her burst and skill do not snapshot, which makes sense, but just wanted to point that out. And also, her Dendra application isn't the greatest, especially since her skill is mostly single target, but I'll talk about this more in the team section. But overall, as you can see, she's a really nice damage dealer, but only when the enemy is burning. She doesn't boost the reaction by itself, and instead, she heavily relies on it to deal relevant damage. And in most cases, her rotation is going to be very simple. Use the skill, switch out if needed, come back when it's level 2, and it has delivered at least 2 or 3 powerful shots from the passive, use the burst, and reset the duration of the skill. I mean, her gameplay doesn't have much complexity going on. She's just a simple and nice Dendro off-field damage dealer. So if that's the case, how do you build her? Okay, so when it comes to her weapons, she's got a decent amount of choices. However, the signature Lumidu's Elegy is an absolutely disgusting upgrade over everything else. Like the damage you saw in my showcase with the Favonius Lance? Yeah, it's not even funny how much more damage the signature can deal. It can vary, but even then, it can range between 30 to 55% more damage. I'm not even sure that there's any other character in the game's history that has such an unapologetic bait weapon. Okay, so what if you don't pull for the signature? Well, most of the 5-star polearms are great stat sticks. Some that stick out would be Staff of Homa, Calamity Queller, Engulfing Lightning, and so on. Honestly, most of these 5-star options are about of same value, maybe except for Skyward Spine, which may end up less viable than other 5-star options if you don't take advantage of the ER substat. Now, as for the 4-star options, if you only want to push for the best personal damage, Missive Windspear is a pretty strong and best free-to-play option. However, in a lot of teams, Emilie will end up as a solo Dendro unit, and she does require some energy recharge if you want to upkeep her burst and the level 2 Lumidu's case. So, Favonius Lance is a really safe choice here, especially since the extra particles it produces can be absorbed by teammates. There's also the catch. It's decent, the ER substat can help a lot, but if you only care about her damage, then Missive Windspear is better. Finally, there are some odd choices like Dragon's Bane. It can be useful against burning enemies, since they technically have Pyro Aura on them, but the Elemental Mastery substat is not that useful for Emilie. Speaking of which, when it comes to artifacts, Unfinished Reverie and Deepwood sets are both recommended here. If nobody in the team can use Deepwood to help boost her damage, then she is going to be the Deepwood wielder here, since it provides very significant damage boost to her. On the other hand, if someone in the team can use Deepwood, then Unfinished Reverie is going to be the best in slot choice for her. But more or less, both sets perform about the same if nobody else in the team uses Deepwood. You also might be wondering, what about Golden Troop? Well, sadly, it's not that great compared to the other two sets, since her passive attack's damage is not treated as skill damage, and overall, the other two sets are just better in most cases. The only exception would be if another teammate uses Deepwood, while you still don't have a decent Unfinished Reverie set, then it's fine to go for Golden Troop. Now, when it comes to main stats, you want to go with a Dendro Damage Goblet and Crit Rate or Crit Damage Circlet. But when it comes to the Sands, this will heavily depend on the team she's in. However, worst case scenario, she needs around 170 70% energy recharge if she's a solo Dendro unit and doesn't catch her own particles. So usually, if she's not using ER weapon substat, such as Favoni's Lance, she will need energy recharge sands. Now, the requirements do go down if you play some teams that don't have a dedicated on-fielder, so you can just stay on the field with her to catch the particles, so then attack sands should be fine with no ER weapon. However, you'll still want some energy recharge from substats. But overall, just aim for 130 to 170% energy recharge, and based on that, you can decide whether to go with attack or energy sands. Finally, for substats, nothing unusual here, just focus on crit rate and crit damage, then attack percent, then elemental mastery if you're gonna play her in quicken teams, but it's not super important. And of course, just keep in mind when focusing on substats, achieve that recommended energy recharge percentage. The thing that I love most about new Dendro units is that they are always gonna find a place in a ton of teams. Well, usually. But Emilie is no exception here. You can utilize her off-field damage in a lot of different comps. For example, my favorite one so far is the Mono Burning Team archetype. The name of course is ironic here because burning does not contribute much to the team's overall damage here. But as you already know, it's crucial for enemies to burn for Emilie to function well. And for this team, the core is going to be Benny and Emilie, while the other two spots will depend. But if you want to go with on-fielder DPS route, it could be Arlecchino, Linny, or Klee, along with another support such as Nahida, Zhongli, or Kazuha. Or heck, you can even use Xiangling for the last spot if you want to. But then there's also Vape and Melt teams. Well, to be specific, Farina Vape Comp works exceptionally well. Obviously, it's not because of Emilie. This core trio has been strong since Farina's debut, but Emilie can maintain burning pretty easily in this comp, thanks to so much pyro application coming from Xiangling, while each of Farina's attacks will vape with no problem, usually. Also, don't forget that since Emilie's damage does not snapshot, you wanna on-field her during Benny's burst, so she can deal increased damage. But then, going over to melt comps, something like Wriothesley, Benny, and Xiangling will work well. But keep in mind, without Animo unit, the personal damage of crowd DPS won't be as great. However, there is flexibility in this comp. For example, you can replace Xiangling with Toma if you need some shielding for Wriothesley. Now, as for some experimental teams, you could go for burning overload comps, such as Sino, Fischl, and Toma. It's a pretty finicky team, it's definitely experimental, and I haven't seen amazing results with it yet, but it is pretty fun. You could also go with Nahida instead of Fischl, who will then boost Sino's elemental mastery and help Toma score bigger overloads. Or you could also even throw out Sino and put Alhaitham in its place. Again, it's a very funky team to say the least. See, the thing about Emilie is that her Dendro application is pretty slow, and mostly single target, outside of the burst and the occasional passive. So she already needs to worry about the enemy burning, and if some other elements mess up the timing of reactions, it's kinda hard to recover from. For example, if you play her in Burgeon teams, unless I'm missing something, you will still usually want a second Dendro unit to help her with bloom creation, because just by herself, she's not able to maintain blooms and burning with a lot of other Hydro units. But yeah, as long as you can keep the enemies burning, any team will appreciate Emilie's damage. And I feel like in the future, she might become more relevant if the new units care about burning, especially since she does have this weird passive talent, which reduces burning damage the team takes by 85%. And I cannot think of a scenario right now where this is useful, unless we're talking about self-immolating Benny. Oh, and by the way, you might have noticed lack of Abyss footage here. Well, due to technical difficulties and for reasons I cannot get into too deep, I only tested the teams but didn't obtain the footage from Abyss. So, sorry. Now, before I share my thoughts about Emilie, here's an overview of her constellations. C1, pretty good. The damage increase is like whatever, but the fact Scent can be gathered faster now means Emilie can trigger more passive attacks, and we all know that damage is pretty chunky. C2, she can now reduce Dendro resistance by 30% for 10 seconds whenever her skill, burst, or passive hits the opponent. So essentially, free Deepwood artifact set bonus, and this will be very handy if nobody else in the team is running this artifact set. C3 and C5, higher skill and burst levels, both are pretty decent upgrades. But C4 is where things become very interesting. Now her burst lasts 2 seconds longer, and the interval for target selection is reduced, essentially making the burst last longer and hit more often. But of course, if you have a couple of $1,000s you want to burn away, getting her C6 allows her to become a true on-fielder, since now she has Dendro Infusion and can deal a ton more damage with normal attacks. But yeah, I would say her C1 is a decent damage upgrade, but the signature weapon is still a lot stronger and can be potentially utilized by few other polearm users. So if you care about that, fine I guess. Overall, I feel like Emilie is a pretty interesting character. I found her to be most fun to use in mono burning teams, and to some extent, burning overload comps, although they do perform a lot worse when compared to the former, but at least it's something new and fun. She's not the most complex character, in fact, I would say her playstyle is kinda plain, subjectively speaking. However, the whole burning shenanigans might become relevant when Natlan arrives, although I am just speculating here, so don't take this video too seriously. Anyway, hope you found this showcase/guide useful, and I would really appreciate it if you could press the like button and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.